What you see up here is, of course, the cover of this book, and let me give you a little bit of background. In 2006, I was talking with my friend Dean Mosier, and we got to discussing bay boats, and the idea came up to build some models and make a proposal and submit it to the Single Tax Corporation and see if they would maybe fund that. And so in my ignorance, I made this proposal and I gave it to the Single Tax Corporation, and they scared me to death by accepting it. And the reason that I was scared was I didn't have a clue what I was talking about. I didn't know anything about bay boats, not a thing. And so I had to get into the research mode, and I started digging and rooting, and as a result, I was able to get enough statistics and figure out to build 7 of the 10 proposed models, which Donnie is gathering together right now for a display. And in that process, I learned a lot that no one else had ever gathered together. And I thought maybe we ought to put this in a book and share it with people, because it's important history of this unique town in Alabama, a unique town in the United States, and actually a unique town in the world. Fairhope, Alabama is. So anyhow, let's get started. We're going to talk about 40 years, roughly, of bay boat history, and we're going to hit just the high spots of it, because there's no way that I could tell you all the stuff that's in the book. Number one, it's too much. Number two, I can't remember it. I mean, once I get started, I can, but you don't want to go and listen to me do all of that. But we're going to hit the high spots and talk from the beginning. So on November 15th of 1894, 120 years ago this past November, a group of 26 people boarded a boat called the James Carney in Mobile at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And they came over to the eastern shore to begin what is now Fairhope. They went down to Point Clear and Battles Wharf and spent the night, and within a few days they had brought a whole ton of land, or begun buying land. Actually, they bought down by the beach right away to start with. And in 1889 or 1894, when they came Mobile Bay, it looked kind of like this. You see, that's an 1889 map, and I kind of doctored it up and laid it a little flat so you could see what's going. But some important features that you need to be aware of in Mobile Bay in those days. Number one is the ship channel was 23 feet deep and 280 foot wide. It had been dug out. And they were going to dig it out again in 1896, and indeed they did dredge it again. This feature, the 12-foot curve, is very important. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And the 12-foot curve, actually what that is the place in those days in the bay where when you got there, it sort of just dropped off to 12 feet. You know, the bay is kind of shallow out there. And so that's important. Communities that were thriving at that time, more or less, was Daphne and Montrose, Battles Wharf, Point Clear, and then Zundels Wharf is down below down here. And then, of course, we have Weeks Bay, Fish River, Magnolia River, and some little communities, people scattered about down in there. And then the people that had come on the James Carney came, and when that boat came, this is the route that it took. That route right there is about 3 hours long back in those days, roughly. They didn't go that fast. That would have been something. So anyhow, now that's how they got there, and that's the way and those straight lines that you see up here, those are steamboat routes. They had to kind of adhere to those, otherwise they'd run aground, even though they were shallow draft vessels. So Fairhope then it starts to establish a community. Now we see the importance of the 12-foot curve, because at no place in the bay does it approximate the shoreline any closer than it did at Fairhope. That gave a distinct advantage. You can bring in bigger boats with deeper drafts and maybe haul a little bit more freight. Well, at that time, the James Carney was owned by Eastern Shore Transportation Company, and it was actually a very new boat. It was only about 6 months old. They also owned this old former blockade runner called the Heroine. They pronounced it Heroine, and it had been, he had brought that in here in about 1890, had it fixed up like this. So now Eastern Shore Transportation has two boats that they're running along the shore here, the James Carney and the Heroine. Now, it became apparent real quickly to the people of Fairhope that if they were going to grow and they were going to thrive, they were going to have a pier. And they're going to have regular transportation by steamboat. As Donnie eloquently explained, if you want to get somewhere, you got there by steamboat back in that day. So they built this pier, and this is the way the pier looked as of July in 1896. That pier was 1,800 feet long. That's about 400 feet longer than the current pier. I think it's listed at 1448, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. This thing went out 1,800 feet. They spent a whopping $1,300 building this pier. And you say, well, that's not much money. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Because back in 1896, an ounce of gold cost $18.94. Well, if you figure it according to today's numbers, that's about a factor of 60. So that pier cost about $75,000 to $80,000. It was a lot of money. And the people didn't have $75,000 or $80,000. So you say, well, how did they do that? Well, they used what was called a Guernsey market scheme. And the Guernsey market scheme was an idea that had been developed in the Isle of Guernsey off of England back in 1815. And the basic premise, this may sound a little bit like our government, but it says, if you want something and you don't have any money, why would you let that stop you? You know? And so, but I mean, you know, I don't want to be critical. But anyhow, it goes like this. You print and give out certificates in payment for work done, anticipating that the value of those certificates will be backed up by goods and services that will come into being. So steamboats that are landing at the pier, paying wharfage or landing privileges, people paying for freight and stuff to use the pier, will generate money in the coin of the realm, which is United States dollars. When they take those dollars in, they redeem these certificates from the people, and everybody gets paid. Fairhope had all the materials. None of this stuff had to be bought anyplace else. They had sawmills. They had everything they needed right here. And so that's how they built it. They used that scheme a couple times for different projects. I think it's illegal now. I don't know. But, you know, whatever. So anyhow, once they got that built, then they needed some regular service, and they tried to get Eastern Shore Transportation Company to give them regular service, and they wanted direct service from here to Mobile, and they said, no, we're not going to do that. We'll stop there a couple times a week, or basically whenever we feel like it. Well, the farmers contracted with Eastern Shore to haul their produce in 1896 at a particular price to market in Mobile. And guess what? They breached the contract and they wouldn't do it. And so the farmers got together and they found a boat that was unused. They leased it themselves, and in the process discovered they saved about 50% of what their costs would have been. And the idea was generated that maybe we could own our own boat. And so in 1901, actually in October 1900, they agreed we can build our own boat right here out of Fairhope materials with Fairhope people, and doing everything except getting the equipment for it. And so they started building a steamer, and they built it right down here on the pier. That's right about where the entrance booth into the park is down on the water there. That's where that sits. This picture is taken in June 27 of 1901. That happens to be launch day of that boat. Why there's no picture of the launch, we don't know. I can't figure that out. But if the guy could have shot that picture, why didn't he shoot a picture of the launch? But anyhow, that's neither here nor there. It's launch day. It is also the place where that boat being built is where I got the name for the book, because somebody looked at it one day and said, you know, given reasonable power, she's bound to be a goer, meaning that she'd be fast. And that's where I got the name for the book. Interesting feature of this picture is, this guy right here, he's got a foot adze. You can't see it in this one, but on a good sharp picture you can. He's got a foot adze there and no shoes on. OSHA would love that, wouldn't they? This guy over here's got a pot upside down on his head, but anyhow. So they launched this steamer in June of 1901. And by early in October or August, it's running full steam ahead. And that's what it looked like before it started full-time service. It immediately was a success because they charged 25 cents to go to Mobile and 25 cents to come back. Eastern Shore Transportation charged anywhere from 35 to 50 cents to go there. Plus, you had to endure about a 3-hour excursion to get to Mobile. You know, but if you can go straight, you're doing pretty good. And this is how it looked. You can see the difference between that and the original one where they were going all around the coast. So people started to flock, and this thing was a huge success. I mean, it was doing well. And in 1905, it went for its inspection, and it didn't do so good. It had a lot of rotten timbers, and so they put it in the shop in 1905 in Mobile, and spent $6,000, which would be about $350,000 on it now, to get it fixed up. And when it came out, this is what it looked like in October of 1905. They redesigned it a little bit, changed the hull somewhat. It was really nice. Everything was going good. The trustee that was managing this account, which happened to be E.B. Gaston, was predicting that they would pay all their certificates off on this boat within 2 years, because it was actually starting to show a profit. One of the big contributors to this boat, and I mean a major contributor to this, and a great believer in the single tax concept, was a man by the name of Joseph Fels. And Joseph Fels, how many of you know about Fels Naphtha soap? Yeah, Fels Naphtha soap still being produced. He was the guy that owned that factory up in Pennsylvania. He was a multi-millionaire. He had businesses in England and everywhere else. He was a big contributor to this boat. Fels Avenue, right around the corner here, is named after him. Well, it was going real well, and on November the 21st of 1905, it was tied up out at the pier here for the night, and early in the morning, for whatever reason, one of the guys sleeping on board was awakened and barely got off because it was on fire. And they cut the thing loose. Guys came running to try to stop the fire. They couldn't. They cut it loose. It drifted down to Battle's Wharf and hung up on a reef down there and burned to the water line. And that's what it looked like the next day. Fairhope was out of a boat. Now, we're going to back up just a little bit here before we move on too much farther, and go back to 1904. If you will. And actually 1903, and 4. Then in 1904, the Eastern Shore Transportation Company brought in another boat called the Calusa. This boat came from down in South Florida, and the idea there was to use this boat to run in Fish River and all of that, because some other people had tried to do the Fish River thing and hadn't done it. And so that boat was used to handle that trade in 1904. They also bought in 1903 this old steamer, which was a revenue cutter called the Lewis McLean, and they renamed it the Lewis Stolive. And that was used, they used it primarily as a coastal boat. So Eastern Shore Transportation Company had these 4 boats. Now, also in 1905, there was an outfit that popped up called the Pleasure Bay or Bay Steamship Company. And they brought in this boat from up in Northeast called the Pleasure Bay. It's really a beautiful boat. That's kind of a bad picture of it leaving. And there's a note on the back of a picture at the University of Alabama that says that it was a prison boat. It really wasn't, but I like to say, yeah, if it was a prison boat, and when they got it and opened it up, look at all the people they found in it. But it really wasn't a prison boat, but it was a beautiful, beautiful boat. It's to me, one of the prettiest boats that served in this area, but it was a boat of bad luck. I mean, they had more bad luck than Carter had little pills. But now we have, at the time of the fire, we have Eastern Shore with 4 boats, and we have Bay Steamship with 1 boat, and Fairhope with no boats. So Fairhope still needs transportation. So what do? Well, also down in Magnolia River, Eastern Shore sells the Calusa to a guy by the name of Paso up in Daphne. Magnolia Springs Transportation Company that popped up got this boat called the Baldwin. It's the only sternwheeler that served the Eastern Shore. Okay? And it served up until 1910. It did a good job. And we'll talk about that a little bit more a little later. So anyhow, now all of these boats are around here, but Fairhope doesn't have one, and they want their direct service. Eastern Shore Transportation Company was hot after it. Bay Steamship Company was hot after it. And so Eastern Shore Transportation kind of struck a deal with Bay Steamship Company saying, look, tell you what, if you'll buy the James Carney, we'll just pull out of the business. Because at this time, the heroine, the old blockade runner, was about gone. It wasn't a factor anymore. So Bay Steamship bought the James Carney. And if you'll notice back here, you'll see right up there that Pleasure Bay and James Carney are owned by Bay Steamship. Well, they still wouldn't give Fairhope direct service. They said, and they were kind of arrogant, actually. They said to the people of Fairhope, quit whining. Essentially you're going to get what you get, so quit whining about it. They didn't think they could raise enough money to get another boat, but surprise, surprise, they did. And by the way, this is just a neat picture I thought of the Baldwin here in the front in the Pleasure Bay racing down the Mobile Ship Channel at some point. But surprise, surprise, in the fall of 1906, get the right year, Fairhope comes up with this second steamer, and it's owned by the Fairhope Improvement Company. Well, it actually went into service on the 1st of January of 1907, and immediately, again, direct service back and forth to Mobile at 25 cents, cut people's fares in half, and immediately started gathering together most of the business. It started what was called the Merry Steamboat War. And these steamboats were fighting with one another, or companies fighting with one another for the business, because Fairhope was the place for people to ship from. And so it was very, very lucrative to have control of that business. Well, about in 1909, the Fairhope management wrote a letter that suggested that if we are going to continue at a 25% or 25-cent rate, we're going to have a little bit more business than what we have. And so they had been fighting with, as I say, based steamship company who was doing all kinds of crazy stuff to try to get the business. They would do things like cut the rate for people going from Fairhope to Mobile. Instead of 25 cents or 50 cents, they do it for a dime. Well, you'd think the people would jump on that. Well, Mr. Gaston, E.B. Gaston, owned the Fairhope Courier. And he loved Fairhope, is his brainchild pretty much. And he would write in the paper to the people and encouraging them to, and they did. This Fairhope would come in with a totally loaded, it could haul maybe 100 people, 115 people, and the base steamship boat might come with 1 or 2. So they were in some trouble. So in late 1909, Fairhope decided they needed a little more revenue, so they decided, well, we'll just start running up to Daphne and picking up those people at a quarter. And they did. Daphne people loved it. Now they don't have to pay 35 cents or 50 cents, they can do it for a quarter. Well, that was too much pressure. Base steamship pulled out of the business. But, be careful what you get, because sometimes it's not all that wonderful to win a battle and lose the war. Because in 1910, in the middle of the week in March, I forget exactly the date, but all of a sudden the Fairhope just quit. They said it was broken and it was not worth fixing, and they gave it back to the creditors in Mobile and they just quit. But I think they knew something. And what I think they knew is that Mr. John Welch was going to do something big. Now, John Welch had been knocking around here a little while, and he was a guy from Mobile. He loved Fairhope, and he owned a couple boats. This one, called the Lucille, actually had been a yacht owned by the Vanderbilts. He brought it. It was, you see there, it says the Fast Mail Steamer. It had twin steam engines and twin propellers, and it was a pretty quick little boat. He had that, and it would haul about 90 people or 100 people, I guess. It was open, though. That one, and then he had another one called the Irma. I apologize for that picture. It's the only picture I could ever find of it, and that's a newspaper shot. So he had these two, and he realized there was money to be made on the Eastern Shore. And in 1910, he goes up to the northeast, up to Hampton Roads, and he finds a really beautiful boat, and he brings it back down here, and it's called the General Lee, and it came in the summer just in time for 4th of July celebration. And you can see that as these guys are coming across the bay, they were going over in this time of this picture to Daphne for a big celebration. A bunch of fellows with their rifles and all of that, and doing all the good pomp and circumstances. And look at all the people on board. That steamer was so popular that people would get off of the pleasure bay and any other kind of boat around just to ride that thing, because it was just one beautiful boat. Pretty famous too, but you'll have to read the book to find out about that. But anyhow, on December the 13th of 1910, it is tied up out at the end of the pier for the night, and for whatever reason, it caught fire. And tied up by the pierhead there, and it caught fire, and the next day, that's what it looked like. And that's what the pier had, that's what all of that looked like. It was burned up, it was gone. And I know you all are thinking now, has anybody ever thought about that there might be a little arson here or anything like that? I mean, that's the first thing that pops in your head. And Mr. Gaston, in his writing, sometimes could coin some or use some rather hard to pronounce words, and I get a kick out of this. he wrote that there has been some talk about incendiarism. Why he didn't say arson, I don't know. But nothing was ever proved, and the boat was gone. Well, you've got the Ermine, you've got the Lucille, you've got Bay Steamship Company with the two boats, the Pleasure Bay and the James Carney. So there's no lack of boats, and they jumped in to fill the gap. Sure enough, they did. Now, Mr. Welch was not to be deterred. But meanwhile, up in Daphne, Mr. J.G. Smith has purchased the old Calusa. Remember I told you it had been sold to a fellow by the name of Paso back about 1905, somewhere along in there. Well, Mr. Paso was going to run it up there, and he did for a little while, but he forgot to pay his bill, and he forgot to pay his people, and for... Of all things, the U.S. Marshals took his boat, and he never got it back. Well, this Mr. Smith bought the boat. He renamed it the Beaver. Now, the Beaver was pretty successful, running between Daphne and Mobile, sometimes serving from Fairhope here, filling in the gaps and stuff. And in 1914, it was written that the thing had a calliope that they had gotten and put on it. It's a 5-note calliope, and they could play ragtime and stuff like that with it. But the problem with the calliope was that if they played it, it used so much steam the boat would stop. So they got rid of it. Well, anyhow, now Mr. Welch, well, we're going to go back down to Magnolia Springs for a minute. In 1910, also the Baldwin, you remember that paddle wheel steamer, the stern wheeler that we had, the picture of it, they had to turn it over to the creditors because for repair bills and stuff, they just weren't quite making it, and so they gave it up. And the Magnolia Transportation Company came up with this little packet called the Magnolia. It's a former, looks to me like maybe at one time a shrimp boat, but anyhow. And this boat ran up until about 1920, and burned out in Weeks Bay, toward the mouth of Weeks Bay, and it burned up and was replaced by a boat called the New Magnolia, which we'll see a picture of in a little while. Okay, now Mr. Welch went up north, and he came back with this beautiful boat, the Apollo. That thing could hold, maybe 400 or 500 people. And at this time now, in 1912, automobiles are starting to become popular. So you had to have a place to haul automobiles. This thing could do it. And it was a big success because it ran direct from Fairhope to Mobile. Mr. Welch loved Fairhope. He actually moved over here. In fact, in the book there's a really good story about his dog, which I'll let you read for yourselves. But this boat served well, and it didn't burn. It was. It actually made it up into the 1920s. Can you believe that? And we'll talk about what happened to it. So anyhow, this boat was doing well. And in 1916, there was a major hurricane that came through here. Those of you who have lived around here for a while, our granddads, like, our grandfathers and stuff, Robert would be telling about the hurricane of 1916. My granddad told me, he said it was so bad you could walk from Silver Hill, where I live, all the way to Bay Minette without stepping on the ground on the downed trees. Now, that might be an exaggeration, but anyhow. This is a picture over in Mobile at the L&N docks. And in the foreground here, this boat is called the James Carney. The beautiful James Carney got crushed and sunk. And unfortunately, they raised it, but it wasn't worth fixing, so it was scrapped. The boat back here is called the William J. Twining. And what that boat is you can see it just floated up and sat on the dock. That is a snag boat. And a snag boat was used to go up and down the rivers and stuff and pull stumps and things like that. But what's interesting about this steamboat here is you see that water line? Look at that. It drew about that much water, like a leaf floating around out there. It's ridiculous, amazing. Amazing. Anyhow, there's a couple other boats that are up there that were significant, and you might read about them in the book, but we don't have time to talk about them right now. Well, so now we have the James Carney gone, but we have the Pleasure Bay is still working, and the Apollo is still working. It got washed up on the beach over at in Mobile, and a couple of weeks they had it going again. The Beaver was destroyed. The Pleasure Bay was sunk, but it was raised and gone. And incidentally, that reminds me, I got to tell you kind of a funny story about the Pleasure Bay. I talked about it, it was kind of snake bit. Every once in a while, something crazy would happen. And I think it was 1907 or 1909, right along in that area. The mast that stands on the fore part of the ship needed to be replaced. So they take it over to Pinto Island. There was a little shipyard over at Pinto Island, and they're going to step the new mast. And they had some big tackle holding this big giant mast up there, and the tackle broke. The mast went through the bottom of the ship like an arrow, and in 10 minutes it was sitting on the bottom 30 feet down. The only thing that showed was the top of the wheelhouse and part of the stack. Well, the company, I think it bankrupted the company that had to raise it and fix it. But the bottom line is that that also hurt desperately the bottom line of the company that owned that, a Bay Steamship. That's just one of many things that happened to them, but they tried hard to stay in business. Okay. Now, in 1918, you remember back in, well, I was going to tell you back here, right about in this part of the time, there's a guy with a real bad attitude by the name of Gabriel Princip, who thought he ought to do something, and he managed to kill Archduke Ferdinand and his wife in Sarajevo, which sort of was the last straw of triggering the beginning of World War I. Well, when that happened, also we're going to back up and say this, that there was a major effort being undertaken by the people of Fairhope, Robertsdale, and Silver Hill to bring railroad from Fairhope all the way to to Robertsdale. It's called the People's Railroad. Fairhope actually had a mile of track. It went from the end of the pier all the way out to out about a mile, roughly. And if you, I think, Donnie, you may have a picture of this. Down in the hospital, there's a picture. In the book, there's a picture of the pier after the 1916 storm with the railroad track just off in the water. But once World War I started, a lot of the young men and families moved to Flint, Michigan, and Detroit, Michigan to the munitions factory. And it did a number on the economic base here in Baldwin County. And as a result, that idea for the railroad just died. And so the railroad didn't make it. They quit. But all of a sudden now, at the end of, I put this picture in just because it gives an idea of the proliferation of automobiles in 1918. All of these boats that we have now have to haul automobiles back and forth across the bay. And this is, as it says, 1918, November 11th, north side of Fairhope Avenue and south side of Fairhope Avenue. Look at all the cars. Mr. Gaston had gotten a call at 3 o'clock in the morning from Mobile on the local telephone system telling him that the war was over. Early in the day, he told the mayor, and he said, maybe we can have some parades in the afternoon. By 10 o'clock, the word was out. People were all over town doing their own parade and having a big time, 10 o'clock in the morning. And that's a neat picture that Stuart the picture man took, showing the automobiles around town. Now, about 1920, Bay Steamship pulled out of the business with the Pleasure Bay. That's all they had left. They just weren't making it. There was a company called the People's Transportation Company had popped up. Mr. A.O. Berglund and some folks owned that. And the idea was to try to get some boats to run kind of in opposition to the Apollo. In other words, what they wanted to do eventually was that if the Apollo's going to Mobile at, say, 8 o'clock in the morning, the Manatee here is coming from Mobile at 8 o'clock in the morning. So they're running these opposite schedules, giving people a little bit more time to be in the city. This boat came in. There's also a lot of maneuvering in between the companies. Mr. Welch's boats now were owned by the Fairhope Transportation Company, Transportation and Excursion Company. And there was a lot of maneuvering around, and eventually these two companies merged together, so now we had only one company managing all of the boats. Now up in Daphne, these boats weren't going up there, but there was a guy by the name of Joe Pose up in Daphne who, I know his great-granddaughter, I guess it is now, but anyhow, he had a very successful business up there, and he owned this boat called the New Daphne, which was a diesel-powered boat. He'd had it built over in Milton. It could haul like 300 people and 10 automobiles or something like that, and he was doing good business up there with that. This gives you an idea of what the schedules look like, and this on the left there is the advertisement from 1922. You see the cost to drive an automobile across is $3 to $5, depending, maybe a little truck or something like that might be $5. In the book there's I tell about how the companies here that were doing so much business not only had to have the business of the local people, but they needed the business of tourists. Today, I mean, Fairhope, it's been a tourist destination since back in the 1840s, 1847, when Grand Hotel started. And it was important, but somebody, and never really could nail it down, was telling people in the West, like over in Mississippi, New Orleans, don't go to Mobile because they'll charge you $25 to go across the bay. And they would steer them up around and make them go over to Pensacola. They accused the editor of the Pensacola News Journal of doing that, but they could never prove it. But anyhow, it's interesting that some of these guys, they got a bunch of flyers up, and they loaded up and they took a trip 1,000 miles and gave out these flyers to all gas stations and places to forestall that kind of negative talk. But that gives you an idea of what it was costing to do it, kind of how the schedules ran. Now, let me get my notes here, catch up with myself. In 1921, July of 1921, the Fairhope Transportation Company brought in this famous steamer that's called the Bay Queen. This was a big one, 185 feet long, 85 feet wide. Don't know what the draft was, but it could haul 1,200 people and 20 cars. I mean, it was big. It was a big, beautiful boat. And it took over from the Apollo, which had just actually worn itself out. And I don't really know what the disposition of it was. I guess they sold it off for scrap or something like that. And then in September of 1923, they bought this boat called the Eastern Shore. Now, this boat took the place of the Manatee. And the Eastern Shore, I remember I talked about a prison boat. This really was. It was built exactly for that, as a police and a prison boat up in Boston and New York area, and they hauled the Reds, which were the communists back in the days, and they'd go arrest them, load them up on a boat, take them to Deer Island, and that's what that boat was built for. That was one fine boat, and from the day that it started in Mobile Bay until the very last time it ran, it never missed a trip, it never had one problem. Now, it's kind of hard to end this thing and make it come out right. But let's back up here just a minute. The Bay Queen ran up until 1929 when, in June of 1927, there was quite a big event that took place here in Baldwin and Mobile County, and that the causeway opened up to automobiles. And there was really not much need for steamboats anymore. They called it the Great Cochrane Birdge, and at the foot of Spanish Fort Hill, back many years ago, even when I was a kid, there was an arch there where it was the beginning of what was called the Great Cochrane Birdge. It was actually the causeway, went all the way across, over up around where the Africa Town Bridge now is, over and get onto Craft Highway and down into Mobile, or Telegraph Road and down into Mobile. When that opened, steamboat business plummeted. And so this boat was tied up in 1929, and Mobile was being refitted for excursion business, which I think it would have been a magnificent excursion boat, except it caught fire and burned up. So that wound that up. Now, anyhow, now the Eastern Shore, it struggled on and struggled on and struggled on. And in 1933, Captain Owen, he had to go and ask the Public Service Commission to let him give up the route. They couldn't make it. And they said, okay. So in October of 1933, it made its last trip to Mobile. They tied it up, and it was sold. A fellow by the name of G.I. Pittman bought it, and it was scrapped not many days later. But it was very faithful. And that particular incident was the exact end of the steamboat era in the Eastern Shore of Mobile Bay, because never again did a steamboat come over here for transportation of people. Now, let's go down on Mobile Bay, down on Fish River. When the Eastern Shore gave up its business, the people that owned the New Magnolia asked to take it over, and were granted that right. And that boat was doing real good. On March 27th there, you see the advertisement there of when it's going to go and where it's going to go, and leave Mobile and Fairhope and all of that kind of stuff. But unfortunately, very, very sad thing. On March 27th, the courier that ran that ad also reported that this boat had caught fire and burned up. But what's even sadder, two young men were back in here, and when the boat burned up, they had to get out. And in order to get out, they had to run through the fire and jump in the river. Both of them died secondary to their burns. Well, they never put that boat back together again, or anything. There wasn't nothing left of it. And that was the end of that. A man by the name of Mr. Forster had this boat called the Hazel M, and he tried to run it. I saw one advertisement when I was doing my research for it to take over that route. I saw one mention of it, and then it was gone, never again. So I don't think it made it. There was no way possible that that could have made a going business of it. So that's the end of the steamboat lecture. And you got any questions? Thank you for listening. Yes, ma'am.
Questions. Do they ever have a bad storm like we just had that yacht business? Do they go through a squall or any time?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. The Fairhope, the first Fairhope, right, one of the very first trips, they had a squall just like that. And there was a man on board who had sailed around the world for almost 50 years. He was going to Mobile, and the weather was so bad. And he said to the captain, if she lives through this, she'll live through anything. Yeah, and many other storms that they had. I mean, ups and downs. There were sinkings. Remember in 1899, there was the coldest ever on record here in this area. In the middle of March, it was 1 below zero. The bay froze out about 400 yards beyond the then pier. Well, you know, the James Carney was puttering along in that ice and ripped a hole out of the side of it and had to drive up on the beach by the pier and it sank, you know. All kinds of crazy stuff happened. It was not, you know, we think it's a glorious time and it's a time when all romantic and stuff. It was tough living. It was tough living. Yes, there were terrible storms. There were, you know, of course, storms. There were fires. There were fights. There was drownings. There was murder. I'll let you read about that one, the first murder on the pier. Things like that, but only 100 and something years ago.
Is that all in your boat, the murders? And
Oh yeah, it's all in there, yeah, and there's lots more. Yes, sir?
What was the relationship of the Sibley Street Park? There was a rail, I understand it went down to the water there to bring goods up or take them down? Up in Montrose. Is that where the Montrose boat?
Yes, I think that's where it was up there. I didn't get into that too much. I mainly stayed down here, but yeah, I think you're exactly right. Up at Sibley Creek, there was Stedman's Landing along up in there and several other landings. At one time, there were 11 landings all the way from from Daphne down to Zundels. 11 different landings. Yes, sir?
You had one slide of a race. Were there regular races? And
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Mississippi, sometimes there were explosions when they had
Oh yeah,
races.
well we didn't have any, the only explosion that I can tell you about that happened here was in 1871. The ocean wave blew up down by the Grand Hotel and killed a bunch of people. By this time they had a little better control of their boilers and stuff, but yeah, they would always race in it. When the first Fairhope was going, nothing would beat the Fairhope except possibly the Heroine. It was incredibly fast, and I'd never heard of it losing a race. But the Fairhope against the James Carney or the Bay Queen or any of these others, they'd get somebody to run up on top of the water tower here in the middle of town, and he'd sing out how it was going. Yeah, you know, such and such is in the lead, and they raced all the time. There's an incident where a couple of the captains with the Apollo and the Pleasure Bay were just tearing across there, and they got so close to each other they bumped. And that cost them a little bit of a suspension of their time for a little while. But oh yeah, they raced, they had a good sport. And you know, while we have all this terrible competition, these men were professional sailors. They understood about the water and about the danger, and if one of the boats went down, they'd blow their horn or their whistle, send a distress, and the others would shoot right to them to bail them out. I mean, you know, forget competition, let's take care of the people. Any other question? Yes, sir?
Were they all wood-hauled?
No. Originally, the Heroine, which was built in 1862 in Glasgow, Scotland, was a steel-hulled boat. Well, it's not steel, it was, I guess, cast iron or whatever. And, but by the time it came here, that old iron had kind of worn out and it had been covered in wood, so it was wood. The Manatee, it was a steel-hulled boat. I think the rest were wood.
Did any of these boats go down to Navy Cove?
Oh yeah, they would go down there, not on a regular basis, but they would go down there on excursions. They'd go to Navy Cove, they'd go down and take a tour through the fort down there. If the commander would let them go aboard or go in, and they'd go around and look at Fort Morgan. And they talked about how when they were firing during World War I, practicing it, on certain days it would rattle the windows here in town when they were practicing shooting down there. But yes, they did all of that, yeah.
what was your policy about animals? Could you bring a horse through a goat?
Oh yeah. They hauled, well, like on the first Fairhope, there tells in there about a guy hauled load of hogs to Mobile to be butchered. But I said, now how did they do that? I was real curious. And what they did, they drove the whole wagon with the hogs on board, never took them off, and then we got over there, drove it off, and then they put the empty wagon and drove it back. But they hauled cattle and they had horses, and if you read in the book, it tells about some of the crazy exploits of that too. So yes, they could haul animals. An interesting thing is that in the early days, it was illegal for a steamboat to haul gasoline. But once the cars started coming around, somehow they forgot about that, and they would just bring the cars because they're all loaded down with gasoline. But it didn't cause any problems. Yes, sir?
Are there any sunken hulls left?
Are there any sunken hulls out here left?
Been identified?
No. I think that the closest thing you would find to anything would be the General Lee when it burned. Sometime after that, they got some guys in with some dynamite to blow it up and make it small. Perhaps there is some debris a couple feet under the mud out there, but probably not much. Any other? Yes, sir.
I guess near the end of that era would be when my mother, who was a young girl at the time, remembered going on these. But I was never clear what folks would do. She was in Mobile when she would come here, I guess, on the weekend. What sort of things would they do once they arrived?
Arrived from Mobile over here?
Right.
Oh, on the weekends, the big deal was they were down at the casino. In the summertime, swimming was a big deal. 300, 400, 500 people would come over and spend the days here. And one of the big complaints early on, or not a complaint, but Mr. Gaston wrote in the paper about all of these people coming to the Eastern Shore to get away from the heat of the big city. He said, here are these people with money, and they want to spend it, and we don't have any place for them to spend it, you know. Well, they fixed that pretty quick, you know. But they would come, and there were guest houses where people stayed. There was, you know, the entertainment, dance halls. There was swimming, and that kind of thing, yes. And relatives, probably. Yes, sir. Anything else? Well, thank you for listening, and I appreciate you coming.